everyone, my name is Delilah.
Hi, I'm Tamara.
And we're here to tell you about vectors. So by the end of this video, we hope that you'll have some idea of what a vector is and some concrete examples.
A vector is a quantity with a magnitude and direction. Magnitude means its massiveness or length, and an example of direction is if I'm driving 50 miles per hour north, that is not the same as driving 50 miles per hour south. Some examples as seen in physics of a vector is position, velocity, and acceleration. And an example in math is 3, 4 in these brackets. And then a scalar is a quantity with only a magnitude, that means length or size. So some examples are 5, 10, 80 meters, or 100 inches.
Commonly represent a vector using an arrow because we can actually draw an arrow of any length and an arrow in any direction. This helps us encompass all of the vectors that are possible. So, if we want to describe a vector, we can do it two ways in two different common coordinate systems. One of them is the Cartesian or rectangular coordinate system, or x and y, and the other one is a polar coordinate system, which is a radius and a theta. So, if we have this vector A, and we want to describe it using the Cartesian coordinate system, all we need to do is drop a line vertically down to the x-axis and a line horizontally over to the y-axis and measure these lengths here, the x and y components of the vector. So here our vector is 3 meters in the x direction and 4 meters in the y direction. So, using the brackets that Tamara showed you over there, we can describe vector A by saying 3 meters, 4 meters. If we want to do so in polar coordinate systems, we're actually more interested with the length of the vector. So here, the radius of the vector is 5 meters, and the angle between the vector and the x-axis is 45 degrees. So we describe this vector using the r comma theta form, or magnitude comma direction. So this A vector can also be described as 5 meters, 45 degrees.
Now it's time to hear some interviews from people who have taken physics and math.
Hi, I'm Alan.
What's a vector?
A vector, physically speaking, is something we say that has a magnitude and a direction. So it's basically how strong it is and which way it's going. So, for example, if I was walking on a train in the opposite direction the train was going, you'd have a velocity vector, so how fast the train is going in one direction, how fast you're walking in the other direction, and the direction matters, and you add those together and you find out your sort of net speed, right? And that's distinct from scalar numbers, which don't have a direction. These are things like mass or energy, where it doesn't make much sense to say like, oh, I have 100 kilograms of mass west, or like 1,000 joules of energy to the north. Like it doesn't make sense. So they're quantities that need a direction to express the full meaning behind them.
And where did you first learn about vectors?
So I first encountered vectors in physics, probably not surprisingly, based on all that.
And what tips would you give to someone who is first learning about vectors?
Keep in mind what's actually going on. It can get kind of overwhelming to just stare at all of the numbers, and you can get lost and drop signs and things like that, which actually really matter. So try to stay grounded in what it is you're actually doing. Focus on what the vector actually represents in a real sense. And that can kind of help keep it all manageable.
Hi, what's your name?
My name is Tamara Dorian.
And what is a vector?
A vector is a quantity with a magnitude and a direction.
Interesting. Learn about vectors.
I first learned about vectors in Calculus 3 and in physics at the same time.
Interesting. Tips would you give to someone who's learning about vectors for the first time?
Always draw pictures because they help visualize what's going on. And don't forget your signs because you get wrong answers.
What's your name?
Hi, I'm Chris.
In your own words, describe what a vector is.
A vector is a quantity with magnitude and direction.
In my words, it's something that could be measured, that has a size and has a direction. Geometrically, a vector looks like an arrow. The size of the arrow represents the magnitude, and the direction is represented by the head of the vector.
Where did you first learn about vectors?
I first learned about vectors in spring of 2016. I was taking 3 classes: linear algebra, physics 250, which is mechanical physics, and calculus 3, also known as multivariable calculus with vector calculus. The thing that these 3 classes have in common is that they all talk about vectors for the first 2 weeks of the class. We talk about applications and we see them in various forms. Well, at least I saw them in various forms since I took those 3 classes at the same time.
If you learned about vectors in multiple ways, which was the most helpful?
In physics 250 and in calculus 3, we dealt with vectors in 2 dimensions and in 3 dimensions. In linear algebra, we dealt with vectors up to n dimensions, which means any dimension. The class that was more helpful for me, however, in learning vectors was physics, because it was more visual for me, and we usually just dealt with them in 2 dimensions, which was easier for me to understand. And also, another reason why physics was more helpful for me to understand vectors was because we did applications. We dealt with more applications for vectors, not just representing vectors geometrically like we did in calculus 3.
What tips would you give to someone learning about vectors for the first time?
A few tips I would give to someone who is learning about vectors for the first time is draw. If you're working on a problem that involves vectors, then draw a picture of whatever they give you. So if they give you a velocity, just draw a little arrow that represents velocity. I feel like drawing, for me, is very helpful because I actually see the vector and I can visually understand it. Another tip that I would give is, if you don't understand it, whoever's teaching it to you, then to ask them questions until you thoroughly understand what a vector actually is. Because once you understand the idea of a vector, then to move forward and do problems concerning vectors would be a lot easier.